Sarah Mitchell wiped the grease from her hands as she finished the pre-flight inspection of the massive C-130, a cargo plane. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. She had been flying cargo routes for 3 years now, but the comments from other pilots still stung like fresh wounds. "Just a cargo pilot," they would say with a smirk when she walked into the crew briefing room. The fighter pilots and transport captains treated cargo runs like they were beneath real flying. To them, hauling supplies and equipment was work for second-rate aviators who couldn't handle the prestigious assignments. Sarah had grown up dreaming of flying. Her father had been a crop duster in rural Kansas, and she remembered sitting in the cockpit as a little girl, watching his weathered hands work the controls with practiced ease. When he died in a crash when she was 12, everyone expected her to fear planes. Instead, she became obsessed with them. She joined the Air Force at 18, determined to earn her wings. The flight training was brutal. She pushed herself harder than anyone else in her class, studying late into the night, practicing emergency procedures until they became second nature. When she graduated, she hoped for a fighter assignment, or at least passenger transport. Instead, they gave her cargo. The discrimination was subtle at first. Senior officers would assign the least desirable routes to her. Other pilots would exclude her from their conversations in the mess hall. When she tried to join them for drinks after shifts, someone always had an excuse to leave. She told herself it didn't matter. Flying was flying, and she loved being in the air. But the whispers followed her everywhere. "Only got her wings because they needed to fill a quota," one captain said loudly enough for her to hear. Cargo was perfect for her. Nothing important to mess up. She clenched her fists but kept walking. Responding would only make things worse. Her commanding officer, Colonel Barnes, was one of the few who treated her fairly. He had watched her handle difficult landings and crosswinds that made veteran pilots nervous. He saw how she triple-checked every system before takeoff and how other crew members requested to fly with her because they trusted her judgment. "You're a fine pilot, Mitchell," he told her one afternoon. "Don't let the noise get to you. Real skill shows itself when it matters most." Sarah nodded, but inside she wondered if she would ever get the chance to prove herself. Cargo runs were predictable and safe. There was no glory in hauling boxes of supplies from base to base. She felt trapped in a role that nobody respected, flying missions that nobody remembered. She had no idea that everything was about to change. The mission briefing seemed routine that Tuesday morning. Sarah sat with her crew in the small conference room as Colonel Barnes outlined their assignment. They would fly medical supplies and emergency equipment to a remote air base in Alaska. Weather reports showed clear skies, and the flight plan was straightforward. Her co-pilot was Lieutenant James Chen, a quiet man who had always treated her with professional respect. The loadmaster was Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, who had flown with her dozens of times and trusted her completely. The flight engineer was Technical Sergeant Lisa Brown, one of the few other women on the base who understood what Sarah dealt with daily as they prepared for departure. Sarah noticed Captain Derek Thompson watching from near the hangar. He was one of the worst offenders when it came to dismissive comments about cargo pilots. He had been reprimanded twice for his attitude toward female officers, but it never seemed to change his behavior. "Try not to get lost up there, Mitchell," he called out as she climbed into the cockpit. His friends laughed. Sarah ignored them and focused on her checklist. The C-130A roared to life, its 4 turboprop engines creating a familiar rumble that Sarah felt in her bones. She loved this moment, when the massive aircraft responded to her commands and lifted away from the earth. The takeoff was smooth, and they climbed to their cruising altitude of 25,000 feet. The first 2 hours of the flight were peaceful. Sarah and Chen traded small talk while monitoring their instruments. Rodriguez secured the cargo in the rear, making sure everything was properly strapped down for the long journey. Brown kept watch over the engine readings, noting everything in her logbook. They were over the Canadian wilderness when the first warning light flickered on the instrument panel. Sarah's eyes immediately locked onto it. Number 3 engine was showing elevated temperatures. She glanced at Brown through the cockpit door. "See it," Brown called forward. "Temperature is climbing. Not critical yet, but it's rising faster than normal." Sarah reduced power to that engine, and adjusted the mixture. The temperature stabilized but remained higher than she liked. She considered their options. They could continue to Alaska with reduced power, or they could divert to a closer airfield. The regulations were clear about elevated engine temperatures, but they weren't in the danger zone yet. Let's keep monitoring, she decided. If it climbs another 5 degrees, we divert to Whitehorse. Chen nodded in agreement. Sarah increased her scan rate, checking the engine instruments every few seconds instead of every minute. She had a bad feeling about this, the kind of instinct that her father had always told her to trust. He used to say that planes talked to pilots if they knew how to listen. 10 minutes later, the temperature spiked suddenly. At the same time, they heard a loud bang from the right wing. The aircraft shuddered violently, and alarms began screaming in the cockpit. Sarah's hands moved with trained precision, her years of practice taking over. Fire in number 3 engine. Brown shouted. Through the window, Sarah could see flames streaming from the engine cowling, bright orange against the blue sky. This was no longer a routine cargo run. This was every pilot's nightmare. Sarah's training kicked in instantly. Her voice remained calm as she reached for the engine fire controls. Fire checklist, number 3 engine, she announced. Chen grabbed the emergency procedures manual. But Sarah was already moving through the steps from memory. She pulled the fire handle for engine 3. Cutting fuel and hydraulics to the burning engine, the fire suppression system activated, sending halon gas into the engine compartment. For a moment, she hoped it would work. Sometimes engine fires extinguished quickly when starved of fuel and oxygen. The flames didn't stop. If anything, they grew larger. Sarah could see pieces of metal beginning to glow red-hot through the engine cowling. The C-130A was designed to fly on 3 engines, but a fire was different. Fire could spread to the fuel tanks in the wing. Fire could weaken the structural integrity of the aircraft. Fire could kill them all. Mayday, 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 Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency. Air Force Cargo 629er, we have an engine fire that will not extinguish. Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable airfield. The response came quickly from Canadian Air Traffic Control. 629er nearest field is Whitehorse, bearing 345, distance 112 miles. Emergency services are being notified. 112 miles. Sarah did the math in her head. At their current speed with 1 engine shut down, that was roughly 25 minutes. She looked at the fire again. The flames were now reaching back along the wing's surface. They didn't have 25 minutes. Lisa, how bad is it? She called to Brown, who had moved to the small window to get a better view of the burning engine. Bad, Captain. The fire is spreading toward the wing root. The aluminum skin is starting to bubble. Give us maybe 10 minutes before structural failure. Sarah's mind raced through their options. They were flying over dense forest with mountains on either side. There were no roads, no clearings, no safe places to put down a burning aircraft. If they tried to bail out, the cargo would continue flying until it crashed into some populated area. She couldn't let that happen. Chen was pale but steady. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Start dumping fuel," Sarah ordered. "We need to be as light as possible. Rodriguez, secure everything in back and prepare for emergency landing. Lisa, keep giving me updates on that fire every 30 seconds. She pushed the control yoke forward, beginning a rapid descent. The C-130A picked up speed as they dropped toward the forests below. Sarah's eyes scanned the terrain desperately. There had to be something. A lake, a river, anything flat enough to attempt a landing. The fire was now clearly visible without turning her head. It created a bright trail of flame stretching behind them like a comet's tail. Parts of the engine cowling had burned away completely, exposing the skeletal framework beneath. Sarah could feel heat beginning to penetrate the cockpit. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom, tight with controlled fear. "The cargo is secured, but I can feel the heat through the bulkhead. That fire is getting close to the fuel tanks." Sarah knew what that meant. If the fire reached the fuel, they would explode in midair. There would be no survivors. She increased their rate of descent, pushing the aircraft faster toward the ground. The altimeter unwound rapidly as they dropped through 15,000 feet, then 12,000. Then she saw it. Through a gap in the mountains ahead, Sarah spotted a frozen lake. It looked small from altitude, maybe 3,000 feet long and half as wide. The surface appeared smooth, covered in snow and ice. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only chance. There she pointed. That lake at 2 o'clock? We're putting her down there. Chen followed her finger and his eyes widened. Captain, that's barely long enough for a normal landing. With one engine out and fire damage, the handling characteristics are all wrong. The regulations say we should make for the designated airfield. The regulations didn't account for us being on fire, Sarah replied firmly. We won't make Whitehorse. That lake is our best shot. She keyed the radio. Air traffic control. 629er is diverting to an emergency landing on a frozen lake at coordinates ... She read off their GPS position. Advise search and rescue of our position. The controller's voice came back, higher pitched than before. 629er, that lake is not surveyed for aircraft operations. Ice thickness is unknown. Strongly recommend you continue to Whitehorse. Sarah looked at the flames now eating through the wing structure. Molten metal was dripping from the engine mount. Negative. We don't have time. 629er is committed to the lake landing. She began configuring the aircraft for landing. Flaps down. Landing gear down. Every change in configuration caused the plane to shudder and the fire to shift. The damaged wing was affecting their handling badly. The C-130A wanted to roll right toward the burning engine, forcing Sarah to hold constant left pressure on the controls. 10,000 feet, Chen called out. His voice steady, despite the fear Sarah could see in his eyes. Speed 160 knots. Fire is now approximately 6 feet from the number 2 fuel tank. 6 feet. Sarah's hands tightened on the yoke. She lined up their approach to the lake, adjusting for the crosswind and the aircraft's tendency to drift right. The mountains seemed impossibly close on both sides. One wrong move, and they would slam into rock instead of ice. Brown's voice came through the intercom. Captain, the wing spar is glowing. I don't know how much longer it will hold structural integrity. When we touch down, the stress might cause catastrophic failure. Understood, Sarah said calmly. Inside, her heart was hammering. She had never attempted anything like this. No one practiced landing burning aircraft on frozen lakes. This was pure instinct and skill, the kind of flying that separated good pilots from great ones. The lake rushed up toward them. Sarah could now see cracks in the ice, dark lines running across the white surface. She had no idea if the ice would hold their weight. The C-130A weighed over 70,000 pounds even with fuel dumped. If they broke through, they would sink to the bottom in minutes. 5,000 feet, Chen announced. Speed 1 for 5 knots. They were committed now. Too low to climb away, too fast to abort. Sarah adjusted their glide path, aiming for the smoothest section of ice near the center of the lake. The mountains passed just feet from their wingtips. The burning engine screamed in protest as damaged metal ground against itself. Brace for impact, she commanded. Rodriguez and Brown strapped themselves into the jump seats in the cargo bay, tightening their harnesses until they could barely breathe. The frozen surface of the lake filled the windscreen. Sarah could see individual snowdrifts now, see the texture of the ice. This was it. She pulled back slightly on the yoke, raising the nose to bleed off speed. The landing would be hard and fast, nothing like the smooth touchdowns she practiced. The main landing gear hit the ice with tremendous force. The impact threw Sarah forward against her harness, hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. The entire aircraft bounced back into the air, fire trailing behind like a banner. For a terrifying second, Sarah thought they would flip over. She fought the controls, keeping the wings level as they slammed down again. This time, the wheels stayed on the ice. The surface held. Sarah immediately deployed the thrust reversers on the 3 working engines and stood on the brakes. The C-130A skidded across the frozen lake, throwing up huge plumes of snow and ice chips. The burning engine broke free. Sarah saw it in her peripheral vision, a mass of flaming metal tumbling away from the wing in a shower of sparks. The sudden change in weight distribution made the aircraft veer violently to the right. She compensated, steering back toward the center of the lake. They were still going too fast. The far end of the lake was approaching rapidly. Sarah could see the tree line growing larger in the windscreen. If they didn't stop in time, they would plow into the forest at over 60 miles per hour. The impact would tear the aircraft apart. "Come on, stop," Chen whispered, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat. The anti-skid brakes were doing their job, but the ice offered less friction than a paved runway. Sarah felt the wheels beginning to lock up. She released pressure slightly, then reapplied it. Pumped the brakes. Find the edge of traction. It was like her first driving lesson multiplied by 1,000. A loud crack echoed through the cockpit. For a horrible moment, Sarah thought the ice was breaking. Then she realized it was the sound of the landing gear struts compressing beyond their design limits. The abuse they were taking was enormous. 50 feet from the trees, the C-130A finally shuddered to a stop. The sudden silence was deafening. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Sarah's training reasserted itself. "Emergency evacuation," she ordered. "Everyone out now, move." She unbuckled her harness and grabbed Chen's arm, pulling him toward the crew door. Behind them, Rodriguez had already blown the cargo door open. Cold Canadian air rushed into the aircraft, so frigid it hurt to breathe. Sarah didn't care. Cold was good. Cold meant they were alive and not burning. They tumbled out onto the ice, scrambling away from the aircraft. Sarah counted heads. Chen, Rodriguez, Brown. All 4 crew members accounted for. They ran 50 yards before turning back to look. The C-130A sat on the lake like a wounded bird. The right wing was a mess of twisted metal where the engine had torn away. Small fires still burned in places, but the main blaze had extinguished when the engine separated. The landing gear had collapsed on one side, leaving the aircraft tilted at an angle, but it was intact. They had survived. Sarah fell to her knees in the snow, adrenaline draining from her body and leaving her shaking. Chen sat down beside her, breathing hard. Rodriguez and Brown stood a few feet away, staring at the aircraft in disbelief. "Captain Mitchell," Rodriguez finally said, his voice full of awe, "that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever seen. You just landed a burning plane on a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere. How did you even know the ice would hold?" Sarah looked at him and started laughing. It was partially hysteria, partially relief. "I didn't," she admitted. "I had no idea if we'd crash through the ice or hit the trees or explode on impact. I just knew it was our only chance." Chen pulled out the emergency beacon from his survival vest and activated it. Search and rescue would find them soon. They had food, water, and cold weather gear. They could survive out here for days if necessary. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Sarah stood and looked at her crew. They had trusted her completely. When she made the decision to land on the lake, not one of them had questioned her judgment. The rescue helicopter arrived 3 hours later, its searchlight cutting through the darkness. Sarah and her crew were cold and exhausted, but alive. The rescue team loaded them aboard and took one last look at the C-130A sitting on the frozen lake. In the spring, when the ice melted, they would have to recover it somehow. For now, it would remain where Sarah had put it down. Back at Peterson Air Force Base 2 days later, Sarah walked into the hangar expecting more of the usual dismissive treatment. Instead, she found it packed with pilots, crew chiefs, and officers. Colonel Barnes stood at the front, and when Sarah entered, everyone fell silent. "Captain Mitchell," Barnes said formally, "please approach." Sarah walked forward, confused. Barnes held a folder in his hands. "The investigation into your emergency landing has been completed. The incident recorder shows that you had approximately 7 minutes from initial fire detection to catastrophic structural failure. The fire reached within 2 feet of the main fuel tank. Had you continued toward Whitehorse as recommended by air traffic control, your aircraft would have exploded in midair with total loss of crew." He paused, letting that sink in. "Your decision to attempt an emergency landing on an unsurveyed frozen lake was against regulations. It was dangerous. It was unprecedented. Barnes smiled. It was also brilliant. The review board has determined that your actions saved for lives and prevented the loss of several $1 million in cargo and equipment. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes but forced them back. Barnes opened the folder. Furthermore, I am recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism in aerial flight. The board has also approved your transfer to the test pilot program if you wish to accept.
Oh.
The test pilot program. It was one of the most prestigious assignments in the Air Force, reserved for the best pilots. Sarah looked around the hangar at the faces watching her. Many of them were pilots who had dismissed her as just a cargo pilot. Now, they looked at her with respect. Captain Thompson stepped forward from the crowd. His face was red, and he looked uncomfortable. Captain Mitchell, I owe you an apology. I said some things about cargo pilots and about you specifically that were wrong. What you did up there took skill and courage that most of us will never have to prove. I was out of line. Sarah nodded slowly. Apology accepted, Captain. Over the next few weeks, the story spread throughout the Air Force. News outlets picked it up. Sarah found herself doing interviews she never wanted. People called her a hero. She deflected the praise, insisting she had just done her job. But late at night, alone in her quarters, Sarah allowed herself to feel proud. Not because she had proven the doubters wrong, though that felt good. Not because she was receiving recognition, though she appreciated it. She felt proud because when the moment came, when everything was on the line, she had trusted her training and her instincts. She had made the right call. 6 months later, Sarah completed test pilot training at the top of her class. She went on to fly experimental aircraft, testing new systems and pushing boundaries. She eventually became an instructor, teaching young pilots the skills they needed to handle emergencies. Whenever she spoke to new students, she told them about that day over the Canadian wilderness. She described the fear, the fire, the desperate search for a place to land. Then she would look at each student and say the same thing. People will judge you by your assignment, by your background, by things that have nothing to do with your skill as a pilot. Let them talk. When it matters, when lives are on the line, your training and your judgment are all that count. Trust yourself. Trust your crew. And remember that being just a cargo pilot or just anything else is never just anything. Every flight is important. Every mission matters. Fly like it does. Years later, Sarah Mitchell retired as a colonel with dozens of successful test flights to her credit. But she never forgot that frozen lake in Canada. Or the moment when she proved that skill and courage matter more than anyone's opinion. The burning C-130A had given her more than a story to tell. It had given her the respect she had always deserved and the confidence to claim it.